Hi, thank you. So excited to be here. My name is Melanie Sumner. I might be new to some of you, but others may know me from talks I've given about accessibility at other tech conferences. I've been creating things for the web for almost 30 years now and have specialized in accessibility and web development and software engineering for the past 15 years or so. I'm the product accessibility lead for design systems at HashiCorp. I'm also an invited expert for the WAI ARIA working group and the co-editor of the accessible name specification for the W3C. And in all the rest of my free time, I work on open source. I'm a core team member for the Ember.js framework and have been leading accessibility work for that JavaScript framework. In addition to some of the open source work I do in Ember, I have a few other open source projects. I'm gonna highlight 3 of them today because I like to invite people to participate. The first is the accessibility or A11Y automation tracking website, where I'm working on tracking the availability of automated tooling to detect specific accessibility violations. And that's available at a11y-automation.dev. Another product I have is pleasefunda11y.com. Please Fund A11Y is a guide that outlines the places where open source work would benefit from funding accessibility things and how they would benefit from that funding. The third one I would like to highlight is Learn to Dev. That's learntodev.info. And I made this after someone asked me, hey, I heard you're a web developer. How do I learn how to do that? I realized that I didn't have a simple answer to this, so I decided to create a website that lists resources in a way that anyone can contribute to, but also makes it easy to find what's right for you. And there's other open source projects that I have, and I welcome participation. Design, development, content creation, even reviewing existing content and providing feedback. These are all ways to contribute, and it's all valuable and important. If you have any questions, you can totally DM me on the Axe community Discord or post to the forum thread for this talk. Giving talks is one of the other ways I'm trying to be the change I wish to see on the web. I make my talks available on Noticed. That's NOIT.ST/Mel Sumner. Most recently, I've been primarily focused on my trademark topic, continuous accessibility, but over the years, I've given a lot of other talks about things like the concept of shift left, don't break the web, and how JavaScript engineers can be more accessibility forward. Someone asked me recently what topic I could talk about for 5 hours without any prep. And without any hesitation, I said, how we get to a fully accessible web, but I think that would be hard to fit into only 5 hours. Anyway, I want to take a minute and talk about why this talk. Why did I write this talk? I work on a design system, and you may have heard of it. It's called Helios, and it's been deeply satisfying work for a few reasons. We have a solid process. We use semantic markup. Our designers create thoughtful, beautiful designs. Accessibility is a non-negotiable included in requirements from day one. We have automated tests, tests we write ourselves, manual tests, visual tests, and even tests on various browser and assistive technology combinations. One of the things I really love is that we create our components in such a way that our Figma API matches our code API. And this, to me, is clutch because it reduces that gap between designers and engineers by giving everyone the same language to use. We also provide documentation that includes guidance for designers, engineers, API documentation, copyable code samples, and accessibility documentation. In addition to explaining the conformance of each component and which combinations will produce different results, we list the WCAG success criteria that are specifically related to that component. Sounds pretty great, right? I love it. But as y'all know, an accessible design system does not make your application accessible. And that is really what solidified this talk for me as more of a talk and not just a saying. While I was working to help make our design system components really accessible, I kept observing similar accessibility issues in applications, and some of them were using our design system. So I started taking some notes, and where were the gaps? And that's kind of what I want to talk about today, some of the gaps and what we can do about it. So that brings us to my most predictable slide, the agenda. First, we'll talk through some UI examples. Then we'll talk about how those examples fail for accessibility. We'll talk about what to do instead. We may have some detours. And I've practiced this a lot, and I will try very hard to keep to the time limit. But first, some disclaimers. So as I've said, the premise of this talk is that we'll look at patterns, and that means real code, real design. And it's really important to know that I don't show you these things to shame any designer or developers. We've all written code as developers that we later looked back on and thought, oh, dear Lord, what did I do? I did that even yesterday. I show real UI and real code because I want to help us do better. And that way we can do better next time and the time after that and show others how to do better too. And while I still dream of the day that accessibility is so baked into the way we craft for the web that I don't even have a job anymore, I've said it before and I'll say it again. Accessibility is a journey that's about progress, not perfection. So let's dive in. First step, accessible names. How do you make unique accessible names? This first UI example demonstrates something that's super common in technical applications today. The ability to add integrations with different products, or maybe even log in with different platforms. In this UI, we have small cards, each with a company's logo, the name of the company's product that could be integrated, and a link that will take you to the page where the user can perform that action. It's a link styled as a button with a plus sign icon and the word add. Where this breaks for accessibility is that all of these links have the same accessible name, even though they go to different URLs. In this case, if the user is navigating by rotor, and the rotor is the mechanism that allows users to navigate through a site by groups of elements when using VoiceOver on a Mac. It's called different things on different screen readers, but for Mac, it's a rotor, so that's what I'll call it today. Anyway, in this case, we open up the list of links, and we can see that all of these links are named add. Add, 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 add. Add what? There's no way to differentiate these links from each other in the same way that a sighted user can if they're looking at the interface. Oops. And even if the user navigates the UI with just the tab key, not using the rotor, going from one interactive element to the next, they will still hear add link over and over again, and that's not useful. Let's imagine what this code might look like. Now, the code sample I have here is real code, but it's heavily edited so we can focus on the important stuff for this talk. This code sample is in Ember, and it uses both handlebars and angle brackets in its templating language. However, it should be relatively identifiable to most web developers what we're trying to do with this piece of code. Each is telling us that we're going to have an array of potential integrations and iterate over them to create each of the cards rendered to the browser. We have an SVG icon, the logo of the company, and we've hidden that with ARIA hidden because it's decorative. We have the name of the potential integration. We have the link to navigate to the route or URL that will allow the user to add that integration. And we can even imagine the styling that went in to make the little cards that render into the browser. Oh, yeah, there's a little card. In this case in particular, we have some equally viable options to consider for fixing it. So let's talk about them. ARIA label and ARIA label by. The ARIA label value takes a string. The ARIA label attribute takes a string value. It's a good option for when there's no existing element to reference. Like say you have an icon button, you need a name, and the ARIA label is good for that. Sometimes it's a bit quicker to implement, especially in like a JavaScript framework kind of situation. It's not additive. It will replace the content with its value. And then we have the ARIA labeled by attribute. It takes an element's ID attribute as its value. It can have multiple values. It will ignore repeated values, and it can even reference itself. And again, it will replace the text content with its calculated total value. So let's talk about the option using the ARIA label attribute to fix this code. In this approach, we add the ARIA label attribute to the link, and we'll concatenate the word add along with the integration name. Now, if you're internationalizing your apps, you'll have a property there instead of the word add, so that translations will work properly, but you get the idea. Now, when rendered, like before we made any code changes, we still have the same visual elements in the browser. But unlike before, we'll have a new accessible name. The screen reader will tell us something like add GitHub Actions link. Now let's talk about using the ARIA labeled by attribute to fix this problem. We'll start by adding an ID attribute to the div element with the integration name on it. Then on the link element, we'll add the ARIA labeled by attribute and set the value to the two attributes we want to use in the order we want them to be read to the user. So we have the two ID attributes on the div with the integration name and on the span with the word add to it. And when rendered, like before we made any code changes, we'll still have the same visual elements in the browser. But again, unlike before, we'll have a new accessible name, add GitHub Actions link. So there's another option for you. I'll say I typically prefer the ARIA label approach because 9 times out of 10 for me as a JavaScript engineer, it's just faster to implement. But your mileage may vary, so choose the one that works best for your situation. Anyway, if we compare the rotor list to the one we saw before, where the list of links did not have unique names, and we pull it up again after changing the code to use one of the solutions we just talked about, we'll notice a totally different list of links. Add AWS Secrets Manager, add GitHub Actions, add HTTP Terraform, and so on. We can immediately notice the improvement. The user can now differentiate quickly and easy. And here's a little bonus example, an accordion item using the ARIA labeled by attribute. I actually came up with this one working with one of my colleagues, Lee, on kind of how do we work with this accordion. Now, by adding an ID attribute to the H2 element that gives the accordion item a heading, we can then use that ID attribute for the value for aria labeled by on the button element, the icon only button that's used to expand or collapse the accordion panel. And furthermore, because we have our expanded attribute here, the user will be informed if the element is expanded or collapsed. So we get that information for free. Okay, I did warn you there might be a little detour. And guess what? It's time for a detour. A detour into the accessible name and description computation specification. Whew, that's a mouthful. I just call it AccName. You can call it that too if you want. It's easier and folks will know what you mean. This detour is happening because I'm one of the co-editors and I've had too many developers tell me that they don't understand AccName, and I kind of feel responsible for that a little bit. So I want to take a few minutes and explain some things because I think it's really valuable to understand under the hood what's going on here. And I'm going to explain this to you from both the browser angle and the developer angle because the context really matters to understanding how this works. So a little mindful agenda. We're going to have some context, then we'll look at the accessible name instructions for the browser, and then we'll look at some ways that the browser's like, yeah, but no, browser exceptions. And then we'll look at some name guidance for developers. And then we're going to switch over and we're going to talk about the accessible description instruction for browsers. And finally, the accessible description guidance for developers. So I thought, lists, 3 things I want you to know. It was 5, and then I was like, that's too many. So now it's 3. First, it provides browsers with instructions for how to calculate the accessible name and the accessible description. Both may exist. One or the other might exist. Neither may exist. They have rules and a way to figure that out. Browsers need to figure that out because the browser's goal is to return results to the accessibility object. And they will follow the specification for the most part, but they might do other things if they're convinced they need to do that. Exceptions. Browsers are supposed to return the first thing they find, looking in this order. ARIA labeled by, then an ARIA label with a non-empty value, and we'll talk about non-empty in a sec. Then look for an ARIA described by attribute. Yes, the ARIA described by attribute can be the accessible name if no other accessible name already exists. Then look for semantic content like the text of a button, the text of a label, a legend text. And finally, if there's something else, look for title or placeholder attribute if they exist. Like that's the fallback, the last thing we try. But there's some gotchas. And I want to talk about those so you don't run into them and then you're like, oh, no, why didn't you tell me? So I'm telling you. We noted that they must return the first thing they find, even if that thing is an empty string. And what I mean by empty string is a space in your quotes. You might think it's an empty string because there's no real value there, but a white space is considered a non-empty string. So make sure if you really don't mean for a space to be there between your quotes, you really want it to be empty. No spaces. Take them out. Make sure they're not there. There's some really weird edge cases to this one, so just double check your work. Second, they can choose to expose text even if it has the ARIA hidden attribute on it. Now they'll do this in cases where you've referenced the element, but that element has ARIA hidden on it, they'll choose to expose it anyway. Um, they'll sometimes do it if they cannot otherwise find an accessible name and determine that ARIA hidden was used incorrectly. And the reason they do this is that many feel it's better to return something to the user rather than nothing. So, there be dragons. Make sure you're testing your UI with a few different browser and screen reader combinations so that you know what to expect. And trust me, the more you do this, the faster you'll get, the easier it will be. And finally, there's no specifications for implementing exceptions. It's a wild west. This means that browsers implement exceptions as they see fit. So the thing is, if you're not trying to do weird stuff, the code rendered to the browser is valid HTML, not just doesn't break HTML, but actually valid HTML, then you'll probably be fine. It's, in my experience, it's when developers try to get too clever and be tricksy hobbitses that these exceptions and edge cases might crop up. So let's talk about you, the informed developer, works to provide an accessible name. Semantic content should be your default go-to. The first rule of ARIA is to not use ARIA if you can help it. So semantic content is really the best and most reliable thing you could do. If a suitable element that can be used to provide label content, then use ARIA labeled by attribute. If no suitable element already otherwise exists, then use the ARIA label attribute. And just don't use placeholder and title attributes. Like, just don't do it. You might want to. Your designer's like, can't we? It's technically okay. Yeah, but no. Like, it wasn't implemented consistently, and that means it's not a great experience for everybody. So just, it's legal, but like, please don't do it. That's what I'll say. And for JavaScript developers specifically, internationalize your apps correctly and you'll be fine. You might read online that ARIA label and etc. is not translated. It's sort of a clickbaity title thing that's sometimes used on social media. What it's really referring to is sites that rely on Google Translate in the browser to translate the page. But if you're JavaScript engineers, you're working in a framework, you're internationalizing your apps correctly, you don't have to worry about that. So accessible descriptions, let's talk about the browser instructions. The browser is supposed to look for an ARIA described by attribute if not already used for an accessible name. Then, if not already used, look for the ARIA description attribute. This is kind of newish also. It's cool, check it out. Then look for elements that are eligible for the description calculation and are not already used in the accessible name computation. Things like a table caption, text element. And then the title attribute value, again, if it's not already been used. Again, these are in the spec, and these are the browser's instructions for what to look for and in what order. So how do you, the developer, prioritize? First up, no surprise here, semantic content. Use the table caption element. Next up, use the ARIA described by attribute for help and error text on things like form inputs. It takes an ID as a value. It can have multiple values. The ARIA description attribute is also a possibility. It should have a string value, but I prefer you to put it in the DOM because then that's useful for everyone. If you're working with a designer that really is like, but it needs to be uncluttered. Okay, use ARIA description. But if you can, advocate for the text to be in the DOM and visible because that's useful to all your users, not just some of them. Lisa, you can think of Loosely, you can think of ARIA described by as a description element equivalent of ARIA labeled by, and ARIA description as the equivalent of ARIA label. Okay, so that ends our detour. If you have specific questions or you want to know more about why it's hard to define white space rules in the AccName spec, DM me on Discord or just ask me later. It's fine. Okay, on to the next. Let's look at headings, labels, and instructions. And I've grouped it this way because there's WCAG guidance about headings and labels and instructions. And in my experience, they kind of end up being related to each other. So that's how I've done it. So first up in our headings, labels, and instructions section, let's talk about headings. Here's your HTML heading, or here's your headings cheat sheet. HTML headings use HTML heading elements for semantic meaning, CSS for styling. Give every section a heading. Put your headings in order. Now, browsers will change and over time expand to support more things, but these rules will always be correct no matter what. These are like the OG rules. So try to do like this as the default, and then if you have to get creative from there, like maybe it will work, but this is like solid. You can take this one to the bank. And let's talk about an example. If you have, say, a modal, and you give that modal a title, and that modal's title looks like a heading, but that modal's title that looks like a heading doesn't sound like a heading to a user with a screen reader because the underlying code uses a div and not a heading, then it's not a heading. It's an accessibility failure. Oh no. This matters because the heading tells the user what that part of the page is about. This matters because users with screen readers can navigate to the next heading with a keyboard shortcut that's built in. This matters because users with screen readers can navigate through a list of all the headings. This matters because it provides users the way to quickly navigate to the part of the page that they care about, or get an overall idea of what the different sections of the page are, like sighted users can do, all at once, with their eyes. So, what do you do instead? Well, turn it into a header if it's acting like a header. Let's think about that modal code. A modal, when implemented correctly, will use a dialog element, and when open, mark the rest of the page as inert or unusable, unreachable. If we think about this from the perspective of the user with assistive technology, and we've done our focus traps properly, either the page exists or the modal exists, but both do not really exist at the same time. If we pair this understanding with the concept of have a single H1 per page, then we can see that the modal should, logically, have an H1 element as our title heading element. We will only have a single H1 element when the modal is open. When the modal is closed, the page's H1 element is now the only H1 that exists. We will only have a single H1 at a time. I know, it's brilliant. Okay, next up in our headings, labels, and instructions, let's talk labels. Here's your label cheat sheet. Exists. An input label must exist, and that relates to 3.3.2 labels and instructions. Correct. The markup for the label must be valid, and that relates to WCAG info and relationships and name role value. Clear. The label must be informative, and that relates to 2.4.6 headings and labels. And finally, visible. The visible name must be in the accessible name. And this is for users who use speech control software. And that's 2.5.3 label and name. So that is 5 WCAG success criteria for a label. 5 different ways a label could fail accessibility. So this is kind of why I tell developers don't get too bendy with your code, because like there's a lot of details in there and not one thing. So let's look at some examples. First up, we have a form label with a form input with the label of application name. Let's think about what the rendered code might look like. We have a label with the class of label. The text in the label is application name. And then we have an input with a class, a name, and type of text. So let's apply our little cheat sheet. Does the label exist? Yep. Is it correct? Well, we're not using the for ID approach to associate the label and the input. We haven't wrapped the input in the label, so this is not correct. Is it clear? Does the user know what the input expects from them? And I think the answer here is yes. Application name is quite clear. And is the visible name in the accessible name? Well, since the accessible name is non-existent, the visible label can't possibly be in it. So no, 3 failures for one thing. Okay, let's talk about another example. We have a form input with the label of name on it. Again, thinking about the rendered code, we have the label class of label, and it does have a for attribute, and the label text is name. And then we have an input with the class ID, name, and type. So does the label exist? Yes. Is it correct? Yes. The label has been associated with the input with the for ID attribute approach. Is it clear? I say no, because name. What are you talking about? First name, last name, full name, application name, cat's name? What does name mean? What does it even mean? I would fail this because it's not informative enough. Visible. Is the visible name in the accessible name? Yes, the visible name is in the accessible name, so it would pass that. So fixing our labels, let's look at a corrected sample and use the application name labeled input. We've added the for attribute to the label element and the ID attribute to the input element. How does that stack up? Exists? Yes. Correct. Yes, it's now correctly associated. Clear? Well, we passed that before, so we're not going to fail it now. Application name is the clear enough label. Is the visible name in the accessible name? Yes, sir. So there you go. Let's have a little bonus example. Here we have a form asking you for your cat's name. So cat's name and text input. And we see a label with the for attribute and it says cat's name. That's great. We have an input. Oh, the input has an ARIA label. And it says, what do you call your cat? We've got a class, we've got an ID attribute for the, labels for, and a name, and it's a type of text. And when we focus on the input field, we hear, what do you call your cat? Edit text. So let's check it. Label exists? Yep. Is it correct? Yes, the label's associated correctly. Is it clear? Yes, it wants my cat's name. In both cases. What's your cat's name or what do you call your cat? Is the visible name in the accessible name? This is where it fails. The visible label is not in the accessible name. And oh no, I was just trying to be helpful. Maybe I should just not try to be helpful. I think I'm going to go pout for a little while. And I'll tell you this for free. You can still give that little extra hint to users with screen readers and you don't have to pout. Okay, I'll stop pouting. Good job. In the cat's name example, it was incorrect because the visible label wasn't in the accessible name. However, If we change ARIA label to ARIA description, we get green lights all the way. Now, don't do this for all help texts, but if you need to add a little something extra for users with screen readers, you could do it this way. Your mileage may vary, so test it out, see how it works. Okay, so now to the third part of this, instructions. Sorry, the third part of heading, labels, and instructions section, we have instructions. Let's think about the instructions in the terms of the help text for input fields. And let's look at the modal example that I have. And I'll say a brief exercise for the sighted users in the audience. How many accessibility issues do you think you see just by looking at it? We have a modal with delete app as the title. And the text is, this action will remove all secrets and their versions from the app test 1. It cannot be undone. And then we have an input with the label that says confirm and a required badge thing. And the help text is to confirm, type delete below. And the placeholder in the input field is delete. And at the bottom, we have another delete, a delete button that is disabled and a cancel button that is not disabled. Okay, so there's 4 issues here. First, we have the word delete. Oh, chat says video stopped. So we're gonna take a pause. Okay. First, we have the word delete in all uppercase. This is problematic when done like this, because not all screen readers treat uppercase letters consistently. Even within the same screen reader, different voice engines have varying levels of support to read out uppercase letters correctly. Second, we have the help text. To confirm, type delete below. Now, the user with the screen reader only hears this when they're focused on the input field. So what does below mean? It's considered a sensory characteristic, and we want to avoid that. It only has meaning for the sighted user, but there's only one form field, so just barely has meaning, and even then, probably confusing. And third, we have a button with a disabled attribute, which means the user might not even know that the button is even there. Now in VoiceOver, it will say button dimmed, which is a hint to the user that there is a button there, but it's disabled. But in general, if an interactive element has a disabled attribute, then it's completely hidden. So let's talk about the scenario that we've created in our UI. We have delete in all uppercase. We have a delete button that won't be enabled for interaction until we get it right. Only the user might not hear that it's in uppercase. And the user could type delete in lowercase, and if they haven't gotten the right instructions, nothing will happen. They're blocked from continuing, but they have no guidance as to why. So what do we want to do instead? Now let's pretend that we're just going to fix it as developers because our designer is super busy, or we had a fight with them yesterday and we really don't want to fight with them today. So we're just going to make it accessible on our own and hope they're okay with it. We're going to change the help text in 2 ways. First, we're going to put a parentheses so that the instructions will say type delete, all caps and parentheses, to delete this application. And you'll notice that we've removed the word below because if you're focused on the input element when you get their instructions, there really is no below for you. You're there already. There's no more below. So in addition to being a violation of the WCAG success criteria for sensory characteristics, it's just confusing in general. So we're taking it out. And next, we have too many deletes. So we're going to update the text of the button element from delete to confirm delete. And finally, we're not going to disable the button. I know, but hear me out. The user will get an error message if they do not fill in the form properly. We'll lean into form validation to do exactly what it was created to do. So it's not only completely acceptable, it's also ideal. Our forms validation can make sure that absolutely nothing happens to the user's data unless they fill out the form correctly, and all users will be able to figure out what we expect from them. Okay, so I am running a little bit behind time, so I'm gonna keep going a little bit more quickly through this last section. Reflow, resize, and space. And by this, I mean 3 WCAG success criterias that are to me related, and that's reflow, text resizing, and text spacing. Now you might hear at work, we're a desktop app, we don't support mobile. And then they will give you a bunch of designs with fixed pixel widths everywhere, which, okay, that's kind of Figma's fault, but you know what? It's only mostly Figma's fault. And here's why. There's math for responsive design, and developers are more than capable of doing math, or maths if you prefer, depending on which side of the pond you live on. So maybe we don't really accept that excuse. We know that target divided by context equals results. And also, it's 2025 and you don't support mobile. Are you sure about that? But fine, whatever. Time is money and money is constraints. So let's shift our thinking a little bit and think about this in terms of desired outcomes. What do we want our users to be able to do? We want them to be able to, we want to support browser zoom up to 400%. We want them to be able to increase the font size. We want them to be able to increase all facets of spacing for text. And I have a little example of reflow failure. I was auditing an app, and it had on the full page, it had a banner going across it to do maybe some upselling. I'm not sure. And the banner elements are placed as designed. The title and the description text come up first, and they're on the left, and there's some decorative graphic art to the right. But once we start using our browser zoom to zoom in, the content doesn't reflow. It starts to become clipped and unreadable. And at full zoom, none of the content was visible. The container was not meeting the sizing needs of the content inside. But when done correctly, none of the content is hidden or clipped when browser zoom is used. And I'm not talking about background graphics, I'm talking about actual content. The content is still visible and fits the viewport, and it doesn't require the user to scroll in 2 directions to see the content, or not see the content at all because the overflow is hidden. This also mostly applies to text resizing as well. While users can especially just only resize their text, a quick way to check is to use browser zoom, and it's an acceptable quick check in most cases. I still encourage you to do thorough checks. And for text spacing, you know, if it's mostly you visit a site and the content fits in the viewport, nothing special there. But it needs to fit in even after the text spacing requirements have been applied. And the container should still accommodate that changed text spacing. The user should be able to change the line height to at least 1.5 the font size. Uh, the spacing following paragraphs to at least 2 times the font size. We've got some letter spacing requirements, and we've got some word spacing requirements. I use a bookmarklet to test this because that's a lot of really specific niggly things to have to do. So what you want to do for this is use all the lovely techniques that we have for responsive design. Relational units, unitless line heights, grid and flexbox CSS, and make sure you test. In the end, browser zoom support kind of ends up looking like a whole lot like mobile view support. And the takeaway here is that if you meet the accessibility success criteria related to Reflow, text resizing, and text spacing, you sort of get some responsive design for free. Pretty neat, huh? So let's put it all together and wrap this up. The WCAG success criteria are the bare minimum requirements for people with disabilities to use the internet. But there's so much more beyond that that we can do to make sure we're providing an equivalent experience. We want to answer the question, can all users use our application in the way it was designed to be used? But I say beyond that, can they use it delightfully? Does it make their work easier? Are we providing satisfaction, or are we putting barriers up and making people more frustrated? I really want to encourage you to think beyond. What are we trying to do here? What are the outcomes we want? What does delight look like? How can we go beyond? Consider the next level and challenge your team. Maybe you're thinking, how can we go beyond? And I am glad you asked me that because I have ideas. Outline WCAG internally and explain the ways your products will commit to doing more. Outline requirements for design, for code, for testing, how you'll integrate accessibility reviews into your product development and release process, and be a little selfish. You know, there's such a thing as an age burst, and the first one happens in your mid 40s, apparently, which mid 40s I've recently experienced, so I'm just going to share my experience. Play a video game one day and you have tennis elbow for a month. Hear a sudden noise and turn your head too quickly. You have a sore neck and that's just your life now. And then one day I needed reading glasses, and 6 months later I needed stronger reading glasses. And my doctor said my eyes will just settle down, but I don't know if I believe that because a year ago I had 20/20 vision. And everything just kind of hurts now. So be a little selfish. Try out your front end with your keyboard. We're programmers and we're more likely to develop RSI. Check the color contrast with an automated tool that does the math for you, because staring at a screen every single day will eventually hurt your eyes. And use browser zoom and see what happens. Give yourself a little break. And also you'll find you might enjoy browser zoom just in general. You'll improve your apps a little bit for accessibility and for your future self. And you might be saying, Mel, I won't be around to use these apps in the future, and I'm sure they're going to be rewritten anyway. But the thing is, every single developer influences the way the code for the web will be written in the future. What are you teaching your team? What are you teaching those who will come after you? What will they learn when they look at your code? Or worse, what will AI churn out because it learned from your code? Finally, I'll just say this. You do not require permission to create accessible code. It doesn't have to be explicitly stated in the requirements. You don't have to be specifically told to do it. Accessible code is technically more accurate. You don't require permission. Create accessible code. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Everyone enjoyed the presentation. We have a lot of tricksy hobbits in the chat, and at least two cats, Pepe and Eleanor, I read. But our first question is from Chris, and he says we code in a way that our Figma API matches our code API. Can you unpack that a bit more? Have you run into instances where you can't produce something in Figma that can just be copied straight into production code or one-on-one?
Your mileage may vary. It depends. Of course, there sometimes are exceptions because you might need a little bit more to be flexible in Figma. But for the most part, when we have a piece of API code or a property or argument name for our components, that name is the same name in Figma as it is in code. Uh, so hopefully that helps. And if that doesn't quite make sense, I can give a few more examples from our documentation in the Discord chat.
Okay, thank you. And then one last one. And again, we could answer these questions in the Discord chat. You know, you'll be there personally, and I know many of these people are also there. But one from RJ. Why use ARIA to update links rather than updating the text and the links themselves to be more accessible?
That's a great question. An use case where that might be what you need to do is when you have, well, in the example I showed, right? The name of the integration was there, but the designer just wanted the add button to it. And that's pretty common for scenarios like that. Or you might have an icon only button. So you kind of need the ARIA label there to meet the needs when design scenarios mean that the button will be less informative if you don't. Yes, of course, you should always try to put the text in the button. That just helps and makes it faster, but it's not always what the designer asked for. And this is a way we can accommodate both.
Okay, well, we thank you. Thank you so much, Melanie, for giving your talk. And we hope to continue this in Discord. So thank you guys and see you guys in the next sessions.
All right, bye. Thank you.